after the recording has started.
Okay, thank you very much, Eva, and good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to you all, and welcome to this webinar series activity of Alternet. Before we start the actual webinar, I want to first let you know a little bit more about the organizer, being Alternet. I'm Maurice Hoffman. I'm affiliated to the Research Institute for Nature and Forest in Brussels, and I'm presently chairing the Alternet Council, can compare it with a kind of general assembly. This is the governance structure of Alternet that takes the strategic decisions of the Alternet Association. What is Alternet all about? Alternet connects European research institutes that have biodiversity as at least one of its main driver for research, but also for communication, for monitoring, and for reaching out to politics and society on biodiversity and ecosystems issues. We are presently a network of 30 institutes from all around Europe, from Estonia to Spain, from Norway to Greece, with institutes from 21 European countries. It was already founded in 2004 as a network of excellence within the European Sixth Framework and was financed by Europe until 2009. From then onwards, we together decided to maintain our activities as a network and consolidate the network of institutes. Presently, we are a self-sustaining international non-governmental organization and organize a reasonably wide diversity of actions and activities altogether. And with any other group of persons working within the scope of biodiversity, we also cooperate, of course. Some of our better known activities are our yearly summer schools, which deal with, in general, on biodiversity and ecosystem services. They are organized in Paris every year, and it is situated in Les Alpes d'Haute-Provence in France. Second in the row of activities are our 2 yearly international conferences in Ghent in Belgium. This year, from the 14th until the 17th of 2022, it is all about transformative change for biodiversity and health. And you understand that this is already an advertising for you to participate to that conference in June. Please visit our website to learn more about it. It is open, the conference, for Alternet members and non-members. A new, reasonably new major part of Alternet is the eclipse mechanism, on which you will hear more in the presentation of Marie van der Waal later on today. Other activities of Alternet are our multi-site research experiments, our high-impact actions, and several kinds of activities on SPI, that is, Science Policy Interface, such as the present Alternet Science Policy Webinar series. Again, you can read all about it on our renewed website. First in a row of this webinar series is the shared webinar of today on science policy for biodiversity, conservation, and ecosystem sustainability, making a difference across systems. Very important, that's second, like the sentence, across systems. You will have a feeling about that when you hear about the speakers presenting their ideas. Today's webinar is organized by one of our members, the Finnish Environment Institute, SYKE, and we thank SYKE for taking the lead in this seminar together with many other people of Alternet. I'll now leave the floor to Eva Primmer. She's a research director at SYKE and member of the Alternet Council, and she will guide us through the webinar of today. Eva, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Maurice, and welcome on my part to everyone, to all our speakers and panelists and audience. this science policy event, a science policy event on biodiversity and biodiversity conservation and ecosystem sustainability, comes at a time when biodiversity is really on the top of our media and our coffee room discussions alongside climate change. Science policy interfaces are those kind of means and forums, ways in which scientists engage with policymakers, practitioners and others, and exchange ideas and look for solutions and develop together policy, but also practice and science as well. And for us who are here today, biodiversity is very important. We share an interest in biodiversity, but it's important to know that the trends that we see in biodiversity loss and ecosystem degradation, those have been shown to us by science. It's very science driven. Then there are a lot of good solutions. We do a lot of protection activities, restoration. We increase the sustainability of natural resource use. And a lot of that is science-based as well. But at the same time, the science policy interface does not seem to, in a way, match the needs of the society level systemic transition challenges that we are facing. And also when we see situations in a local setting, there might be a conflict in a local setting, or there might be a success story of successful conservation in a local setting. We don't necessarily see how that is upgraded to a more cross-cutting system level solution. So we still need to focus on how to develop science policy. And that's what we are doing here today as well. So thanks for joining this. It's excellent. And we are here to think of how to make science policy more effective, perhaps more adaptable, how it could be more dynamic and meet the societal needs of of today. So the audience, you who have joined today, you can write in the chat if you want, and there have been also already some nice postings in the chat. You can ask questions in the chat. We will today have really nice 3 presentations that tell us about the science policy landscape in general, the Alternet science policy activities, and the ways in which governance and policy can be better supported by science. And after these presentations, we will have a panel where we will discuss science policy, and we will also bring messages from other sectors that are not exactly the biodiversity and ecosystem services kind of area, but are adjacent. So forestry, health and urban planning that have clear connections with biodiversity conservation and ecosystem management or harnessing, if you like. But before we start, so that we get a bit of an idea where you come from, we will have a poll for you and you can answer that. Have you heard about Alternet before this webinar? Or is this your first encounter with Alternet? You can choose one option, and then you can, if you see a box, that's the poll. If you just see a black box and you don't see a poll, then there might be a malfunctionality in your Teams, and then we just apologize for that technicality. Or if you don't see it, then once you have submitted your answer, you can close if the poll doesn't close in your window, you can push the cross on the top right-hand corner and it will disappear. And now we start to see that there are some people who haven't heard about Alternet before, so it will be very good that we get a little bit more detail on the Alternet or Alternet, like we say in Finland, science policy activities. And there are people who are Alternet members and people who are from outside Alternet but have engaged in some Alternet activities before or heard about Alternet. So that's a nice distribution, and this is good for our speakers also to be aware of whom we are talking to. Okay, we go to our first presentation that will be given by Ben Delbert, who is a long-term original member of the Alternet community. He's a consultant in his Delberg consulting company, and he will tell us a little bit about the general landscape of science policy interfaces in Europe. So please, Ben, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Eva, and good afternoon to all also from my side. I'll share my presentation here with you. I would say be prepared for a very speedy introduction into the main actors into science policy interaction in Europe, focusing on the European Union and on biodiversity and ecosystems, as indeed the title says. Already said by Eva, what is a SPI, or a science policy interface? It's actually quite a mixed number of ways in which scientists, policymakers, and others link up in various ways to communicate, to exchange ideas and information, and to jointly develop, or as called these days, co-create or co-develop knowledge to enrich policy and decision-making processes and our research. So that's really quite a broad definition that encapsulates a different series of tools, as we will see. You can categorize SPIs, science policy interfaces, in various ways. I lost my presentation. No, there we go. In various ways. This is one way from a biodiversity report from a number of years that I...
Sorry, Ben, I stopped seeing your presentation. I don't know, someone else could say if someone else sees it and it's just me.
Okay, no, there was some glitch here on my side as well, so I'll open it again.
Might have to share it again.
Yeah, you see it?
Looking good now, thank you.
Okay, there we are. So 5 categories that I find useful, which I will touch upon here in this presentation. I'll give a number of examples. So let's start with policymakers themselves. On one side, policymakers. There is no such thing as the policymaker, obviously. So there's various types. I think 2 main categories can be distinguished. Those who make the decisions, actually, the legislators, and those Teams does not like me sharing the screen. It does switch off. There we go. And those who are more on the side of implementing and monitoring policy. At the European level, the EP, European Parliament, and the European Council would be part of the legislators, of the policy makers themselves, whereas the EC, European Commission, is more on the side of preparing policy and implementing and monitoring. Member states play a very strong role, obviously, in all components of the European Commission and European Union, and have their own sets of policymakers in that picture. When referring to Council, it usually is the Council of Ministers, the high level, the heads of state, but you also have thematic councils like the Council for Environment with environment ministers. Then on the other side, you have science or scientific researchers. Again, also there is no such thing as the researcher. You have the individual researchers, you have institutes, departments, expert networks, like for example, Alternet could be fitted into this category. You have policy advisors of all kinds. There's a number of formal ones, like for example, the SAM, the Scientific Advice Mechanism, which feeds directly into the European Commissioner's advice. You have the Joint Research Center, which is a body with its own 2,000 researchers who prepare and manage knowledge for policy support. You have expert groups, over 700 in the European Union, expert groups, like, for example, the Coordination Group on Biodiversity and Nature, is assembled of member state experts, researchers, professionals, and what have you, giving specific advice on the processes. But you also have comitology committees, a very specific term referring to committees with member state representatives who give opinions on draft law and legislation to the Commission. They're a kind of advisory committee, so there's some overlap in there. HABCOM is the Habitats Committee as an example of this. Then you have decentralized agencies. There's a number of agencies like the European Environment Agency, who have a role in collecting information, in stimulating cooperation between member states, again, to combine knowledge and to bring that into the policy sphere of Europe. And then finally, you have a kind of a process, the K4P, the Knowledge for Policy, which is important now also to mention in relation to the newly developed Knowledge Center for Biodiversity, which is a cooperation of the JRC and the EEA with Biodiversa to establish a stronger knowledge input into the policy sphere in Europe. Then you have a number of support tools. I'll not mention all of them. You'll see the acronyms at the end of the presentation. But support tools are actually those kind of sets of indicators, assessments, reports, repositories, online platforms, and what have you, which help this transition of knowledge from scientists to policymakers and the other way around. And the last component in there, talking about helping this transition and transfer of knowledge, are so-called boundary organizations. These are not research institutes themselves, but they might be part of a research institute. It might be a specific department, but they might be NGOs or IGOs, intergovernmental organizations like the IPBES, for example, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. You may have consultancies and the newly coming Science Service. Question mark, because it's yet to be seen where it will be positioned in this big picture of the science policy interface. If you put it all together, you get this kind of impressionist landscape with in the background the Claude Monet impression of a landscape, just to show it is quite complex, and it also depends on which perspective you take on the landscape. So you can have this type of picture in quite a different way as well. So this is just one static representation. Static, I say that because actually there's no such thing as a static science policy interface sphere. Policy is a moving target, as you know. Policy is constantly developing. The European Green Deal is just there since a few years, and it defines a lot of the new policy developments in Europe. The biodiversity strategy for 2030 is a big player in this field. And there's call for a transformative change in this European Green Deal. So there's more to come in terms of transitioning and transforming the society, including also the science policy interface. As part of that, I mentioned here also the new European Bauhaus as a process from Europe to help this transformative change take shape, actually. I think a key message here is also, you've seen this kind of big set of science policy actors. I did not put arrows in there because that would be a big spaghetti bowl to show all the interrelationships. But the challenge is for all of us to speak with one voice, not only for Alternet, but also for the science policy actors themselves, but the biodiversity community, to speak with one voice in terms of supporting this message of a healthy biodiversity. It supports healthy humans, supports a healthy society, supports a healthy economy. So I just leave you with a number of references because this was very speedy. If you want to learn more about science policy interaction in general or science policy interfaces in particular, and there is a list. These slides will be available. All these acronyms, and there's many more out there, might be dazzling for you. So this was very speedy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben. A wonderful introduction to the landscape, and we see really that for someone who is entering this new, there are many entry points and there is a lot to sort of map around. But then it's also somehow safe for us to know that a lot of these structures are in place, and there's actually possibly audience and possibly opportunity to be heard. And thank you, Ben, for the last message where you say that we should speak with one voice. I think that the panelists will be excited to perhaps say something about that. And I think we will also see a spaghetti bowl today in a later presentation. Thank you, Ben. If you have questions to Ben, you can write them in the chat, and Ben can try to answer, or we can pull them up during the panel discussion and Ben will join that. Next, we would like to ask you with a poll about what more is needed, or what is most needed. So you should actually choose only one option. What is most needed in the European Biodiversity and Ecosystem Science Policy interface? And now we are asking most, so you can answer only one, you can pick only one option. If you see this now, I acknowledge that all of the participants cannot see don't have all the Teams functionalities. For those of you who see this, there is a bar, a gray bar on the right-hand side, and you can slide it a bit so that you see the last option. And in this poll, actually, the last option is if you have an idea of your own that you think is most needed in the European science policy interface. So you can write that in the chat. And I will perhaps choose one myself as well. And then you can push the cross to get rid of the survey or poll. So now we are seeing the answers coming. So the biggest bottleneck seems to be time, time and resources to invest in the science policy interface. So somehow perhaps for individuals, this is to fit this in your work agenda, but for organizations, institutions and networks, this is actually to allocate the time for communicating between science policy and practice rather than just doing the science. So that sounds like a clear answer. And also the other choices got some votes. So there are many ways that we can do this. Great. Next, we will go to the Alternet activities, or the Alternet has a lot of science policy interface activities, and those will be introduced to us by Mari van der Waal, who comes from UFZ Science Policy Expert Group and has long-term experience with this. So Mari, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Eva. Do you hear me well?
Yes, we hear you and see your slide nicely as well.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is indeed Mari van der Waal, and I'm working indeed at the Helmholtz Center for Environmental Research, the so-called UFZ, Leipzig in Germany. And together with my Alternet Management Board colleagues, Juliette Young and Alan Watt, we are responsible of the science policy activities within Alternet, which I'm honored to present. Okay, so as a background first, Alternet was involved very early on a visionary road for improving science policy interface in Europe and beyond. And along this road, Alternet, through its member institutions, was involved in key EU initiatives, key EU projects that contributed in shaping what the science policy interface on biodiversity and ecosystem services looks like today. Along this road, again, Alternet has established excellent working relations with the European Commission, for example, DG Environment or DG Research, but also other policymakers at different scales. So what does it mean for Alternet today to be fostering the science policy interface on biodiversity and ecosystem services? It means that it embeds different aspects of science policy interface in all its activities. So coming back to the definition presented by Ben, for example, it is crucial for Alternet to indeed develop the knowledge jointly to enrich policy and decision-making processes, but also to enrich research. But also Alternet is aiming at improving the quality of the research and quality of knowledge that is transferred, and improving the knowledge flow, which will lead to learning and ultimately influencing decisions and changing behavior. What it also means for Alternet is to develop all its activities on the latest research done on how to improve science policy interface and ways to do it. For example, here on the right, you have the 5 key components that the science policy interface needs to include to be effective. So our activities at the science policy interface needs to have a strong focus on process, meaning that from the start, it needs to be clear what will be done and how the transfer of knowledge will be done. It needs to involve different groups to communicate effectively, and it also needs to come up with usable outputs for policy and provide, of course, some capacity building. So concretely, activity-wise, the first one is the biannual Alternet conferences. So since 2013, Alternet organizes every 2 years a conference in Ghent. Each conference is structured around a cutting-edge issue and a policy relevant issue facing biodiversity and science policy interface. So our conference are always hosted in collaboration with the European Commission, and relevant European Commission members are invited to speak and actively participated at the conference, including in the design of the conference. The conference involves a broad participation and contributions from scientists, of course, researchers, but also policymakers, practitioners, and decision makers of all types. So in addition to the importance of the conference as a networking and capacity building event, it is also the importance to the EU and other decision makers actively participating in shaping this conference. And we also produce as well usable outputs for policy, for example, policy brief or recommendation for example, we have done recommendation for the next post-biodiversity strategy, but also the global biodiversity framework. And we also come up with a new method to harvest key messages from the scientific community in order to provide in the development of the post-biodiversity strategy. Another key science policy events as well is our Alternet Summer School. It is an annual 10-day summer school organized every year since 2016, I believe. Yes, so it's the 16th edition this year. As it has already said, it's always in the beautiful village of Peresque in the French Alps. And we select about 30 participants from across Europe and beyond to participate. And we have also people working at the Commission asking to participate and also practitioners. It is an intensive program of lectures on topics such as the science policy interface, but it also includes poster session, project work, and field trips with an emphasis on interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary approaches. So what Alternet has achieved after 16 years is to create a lively network for life. What I also wanted to say is that the next Alternet Summer School will be on the 20th to the 30th of September, and the registration will be opening soon. So don't miss out this opportunity to participate to this summer school. So I believe that the science policy aspect of the summer school is better captured through the hundreds of positive testimonials we receive from alumni. Like, for example, these students who said that summer school had a huge impact on him as he was able to rethink its research in a more mature way and including a much wider perspective to it. Or these other students talking about thought-provoking discussions in a comfortable environment. So to give even more weight on the importance of the Alternet Summer School, I would like to draw your attention to an evaluation survey we conducted in 2016, to which 63 participants to this survey graded the summer school as excellent and 37 as a key event in their career. Of course, another science policy activities for Alternet is our webinar, like the one today. So this is actually our second webinar on science policy interface. The first one was hosted in 2019 by the UFZ. And this first seminar was more about explaining what are science policy interface and their importance. I'll make sure that we are providing you with the link to the recording if you are interested. Last but not least, the Eclipse mechanism. So Eclipse was created as a Horizon 2020 project in 2016 to help governments, institutions, businesses, but also NGOs make better informed decisions when it comes to biodiversity and ecosystem services in Europe. So in a nutshell, it is a mechanism able to answer policy relevant questions from policymakers and other societal actors by synthesizing the best available knowledge using tailored knowledge synthesis methods. As I pointed out in my first slide, Eclipse is not just one stand EU project. It is a continuation of a long series of EU projects and EU initiatives, and it is a concretization of decades of ideas and vision on improving science policy interface. Since December 2020, Eclipse is now functioning as a hybrid mechanism, so partially as a European funded project and steadily incorporated by the Alternet NGO. Okay, this is Eclipse in a nutshell. I don't really have time to explore every detail of it, but we have 5 main functions. The main function being, of course, the answering key question function. But we also have a robust process when answering the needs for evidence. And this is in order to ensure that the knowledge synthesized will be perceived as credible, relevant, and legitimate, so that it can also be used in contested issue. Eclipse has a strong focus on networking through building the network of network and organizing capacity building events. We have also recently launched the ENON, so the European Network of Network for Science Policy Interface on Biodiversity. If you are interested to know more, please check on our website. Another key added value is that Eclipse has a dedicated method expert group advising on the best knowledge synthesis method to answer each particular request. And last but not least, we built all our activities on a strong ethical infrastructure. As I just mentioned, Eclipse's robust process for answering the need for evidence is what sets Eclipse apart. I don't have time to go through this process, but I'm inviting you to go on our website because we have a small video explaining this process. Now, how to get involved? So you can apply as expert on a certain topic if it's a topic that is relevant for you, and you can participate to an expert working group that will answer a policy relevant question. For example, on your screen, you see the example of the outputs and outcome of the expert working group who worked on developing a nature-based solution evaluation framework. This was a request from DG Research. And between the Eclipse report and its follow-up publication, they have accumulated more than 500 papers citing their work. So in addition, the European Commission published mid last year, a handbook for practitioners on evaluating the impacts of nature-based solutions, which, I quote, expand upon the pioneering work of Eclipse framework. Another example is our actually latest report, which were launched last year in April, and they were on the impact of green and blue spaces on mental health. The request came from the World Health Organization and the French Ministry of Ecological Transition, and those reports were followed by the release of a World Health Organization booklet, which draw evidence from those Eclipse reports. Another benefit of getting involved is, of course, direct link with requester. This is to give you an idea of who is submitting requests to Eclipse, at least the one that were selected, because we receive since 2016 55 requests, all asking trustworthy evidence, and we selected so far 16 of them. 13 are already addressed, and outcomes or evidence are on our website, and 3 are ongoing. The first one is from the French Biodiversity Agency, which is linked to the French Ecological Transition Ministry. And it is on incorporating ecosystem services in mitigation hierarchy. This will be finished by the end of the year. The second we have is a request on macroalgae cultivation and its impact on ecosystem services. That came from DG Marais. And this request is finishing, or the expert working group is finalizing their draft synthesis today. So from today or hopefully or tomorrow morning, you will be able to comment on their final draft. So please check on our website. And last but not least, we have a request from DG Research and Innovation on pandemics and biodiversity, developing a strategic research agenda. Okay, you can also, if you are interested, to join our governance bodies. The next mandate is in 2023. All the governance bodies are working in kind except the Eclipse management body. And I believe that's all what I say, because I saw the time and I'm a bit late. So if you are further interested on Eclipse and Alternet science policy activities, please check our website. You can also listen to our Eclipse podcast. I put the the site here, but you can find everything on our website. Thank you very much. I took a bit more time. Sorry for that, Eva.
Thank you, Mari. Excellent. A very detailed overview of what Alternet does in the science policy area. And if you have questions to Mari, you can put them in the chat. Now we would actually want to, maybe some of this was particularly interesting for you, or you might have already participated. So our poll question has been prepared that, have you participated? But it's also interesting for us to hear, if you want to write in the chat, if something interests you in particular. But so we have a poll for you, whether you have participated in the types of activities that Mari described. And now, because the list of activities was quite long, you need to scroll down the gray bar of activities, and you can then submit your answer. And once again, apologies to those who cannot see the poll. I hope you can see the chat so that you can participate. Maybe at this point, when we are waiting for the answers, I just recognized this, that some of the ideas to our previous question, what more should be done in the science policy area, included messages to policymakers and the policy system itself. And that's a good message for Eva Furman, who comes up on the floor next, who will actually talk about how science is communicated to governance. Okay, so the poll shows us that we have now 57 responses, and people have participated in a range of activities, and clearly people have participated in different activities. So it's good to be aware of the whole range, and that's very helpful for us, and we go forward. So next we will have Eva Furman, who is from Finnish Environment Institute SYKE, so my institute. She's a long-term original member in the Alternet and has been the chair of the council and really knows Alternet very well. And she's also super experienced in all kinds of science policy activities, in really communicating results with decision-making processes. And maybe I didn't say that in SYKE, in the Finnish Environment Institute, Eva is the director of Environmental Policy Center that does a lot of this kind of analysis all together as well. And Eva, now the floor is yours. You can share your experiences and views on how governance can be supported by science.
Yes, thank you, Eva, very much, and so lovely to be here with all of you. I'm going to open my slides to start with. If
Looks
you can't
good.
see them, good.
We can
good.
see.
Okay, so as Eva said, I'm going to open up a little bit how actually science-based policy and governance can be produced. And as we already saw, especially from Ben's presentation, the landscape of biodiversity science policy in Europe is very broad and has very many different dimensions, from information systems to meta-analysis, evaluations and assessments, monitoring databases, and the whole science that is behind there in our research institutes and universities and so forth. And we do have the newly established Knowledge Center for Biodiversity actually close to the Commission, or as part of the Commission. And actually, we really need science-based decision-making, because Europe and EU has a strong impact on biodiversity in Europe, member states, but also far beyond that, and both as footprints as well as handprints. And to tackle that in our policies and governance is something that needs to be efficient and well prepared and carried out so that it's durable. And as you can see on the left-hand side in the pictures, actually our consumption and production in EU and in our member states is very much actually having flows and links to different parts of the world. And these flows are connecting our consumption to biodiversity in Europe, but also beyond Europe in different parts of the world. So following from my latest word about this consumption and the whole linkages between different issues, we can have a look at this, that actually to be able to have an impact, positive impact on the biodiversity loss or stop and growing biodiversity loss, we need to pay attention not only to biodiversity as such, but also to other societal challenges like inequalities, waste, and climate change, and all the other parts actually in the Agenda 2030 of the United Nations, which clearly shows that actually to be able to have an impact on the natural sphere, which we of course are working closely on if we are talking about biodiversity, then we need to pay attention not only to the natural science targets and goals, but also those from the social sphere. And this really links us in the Anthropocene together, because we humans are having an impact on the entire natural system on our planet. And we need to do that together, not leaving anyone behind, and pay especially attention to those systems, societal systems that are actually providing us well-being. And here are like 6 really core systems that are at the moment unsustainable. All these are connected to biodiversity loss, and also while transforming, they are connected to nature-based solutions as a solution. So for example, economy, moving towards, for example, circular economy is also linked with land use and biodiversity. Food, very clear connection, urbanization, land use again here, energy system, but also energy services, and then the environmental commons as such and their management on a global level. And then the entire well-being issue with health, cultural transformation and opportunities of us. That's not really on a sustainable path in, for example, in EU, which are fairly wealthy countries. And here is a good picture about food that is very strongly connected to biodiversity, both on the positive and negative side, how we do it. And here is just an illustration about the transformation that's taking place in Finland. How have we already made progress on the positive side, and what are the taboos that are still not discussed in the society, and the vision that needs to be joined not only by governments and the EU policymakers, but also with other actors in the businesses, in the communities, and more so together with science, so that science can really contribute also in this process. So transforming societal systems is often seen quite complex, and it is actually complex, and you can see there are many different layers on it, from environmental to social, economic, and to the policy and legal systems. And as earlier talked, we can not only look at the life on land and life in water, but we need really to pay attention to all of these. And then the stakeholders and the various scales and also the time perspectives are very important. And we need the dynamics. And even though it looks really something that's not possible to do, it is something that gradually moves to the right direction if there is the vision and there is the action that's carried out. And European Union has really paid much attention to this transformative change, which is an excellent angle to this, and including the just and inclusive way of doing it, and putting the protecting, conserving and enhancing natural capital very much in the core. And in the heart of this, we have the EU biodiversity strategy for 2030 that again pays attention to the main drivers of biodiversity loss and raises the important elements of change, the land use, sea use, overexploitation, and so forth. Well, after giving all this to you, especially the science community here listening, it all sounds like a huge mess. And to look at the picture on the right-hand side, it really looks messy, but it actually has to be messy. It's very important because there are so many elements discussing about values and connecting it with the facts and with the science. And on the left-hand side, we have kind of a clean big picture of it, what it needs to be. So we are actually doing problem facing, then we are doing policy implementation, and then we are evaluating, and this goes round. But it actually looks more like the blue one, and when you add the science policy interface in there, it's also part of it. But when you make it more like in a clear way, how can science in this landscape actually contribute? So we have the traditional way, which is also still highly important, bringing the databases of natural systems with the material where you can look backwards and also build scenarios, but also knowing how the ecological and evolutionary processes function now when the natural systems and the socio-natural systems are in such a turbulent phase. But we have the right side as well, which very much talk about transition, and transition research or transformation research is a field of its own, which really looks how you are able to make durable change from unsustainable to sustainable side. Here is also sustainability science that plays a major role and is in a way the big umbrella for that, and transdisciplinary research, which brings different disciplines, but also the different actors in the society that are much broader than actually policymakers. It was very much emphasized in my earlier dimensions as well. And so we need to remember that there is lots of data already and existing knowledge that we have. We need to use that global wise to be able to make have the kind of basis, and we need to have more equal density of research in different parts of the world. This really shows that how we have gray areas with hardly any science capacity, or it is very sort of thin. And if you look at the science policy interface, it's even bigger. And here we need to collaborate. We need to open our data. We need to open our infrastructures and to build this in collaboration, not in such a way that from EU we are traveling to different parts of the world and doing things and coming back. Of course, I'm exaggerating. Many things are happening. Well, when we are actually looking at the table, science policy table, this is, of course, a kind of a metaphor of the bigger one that could be a platform, or we could call it agora, where we meet. We really meet with the policymakers. So when we look at this from the scientist perspective, we really are invited to bring our best available knowledge to these tables, but also taboos and unknowns. And then what we gain from there is that we get questions and requests that actually scientists and different actors has formulated together with policymakers. And that's actually quite useful for all of us, because we can make our research visible, we can collaborate with other researchers, we learn, and we also get something for our CV and maybe some funding with all this knowledge. And we can look at also from the other side, from the policymakers' perspective. And again, we gain what the scientists are bringing to the tables. And then again, we are contributing as policymakers these questions that we are then formulating together with the researchers and some other actors. So it's a very good way of really doing evidence-based policy where you look in a more durable and in a broader perspective. You also get to know the scientists and understand the logic, but you get small hints about this silent knowledge of unknowns and about these taboos. And so it's very much a shared challenge that we need to make kind of a continuous co-learning and co-developing, co-evaluation to be able to reach this next generation science policy interface. And this requires some humble approach from both science actors as well as policy actors to look at the practices, how we're actually doing it, and also changing the processes. Not offering only what we have just in the pocket, but really understand what the other one is needing or the other one is able to produce. So this way we can make something that is more long-lasting and also takes a broader perspective. Coming back to where I started with this big landscape, it's really a huge capacity that we have offhand, but it is still with lots of overlaps. There are many doing same things, and the decision makers are a bit lost where to get the best knowledge. And as someone brought up, Ben, in the beginning, that it's quite confusing getting many different signals, but there also are gaps that no one is covering or that are not made available to the decision-making process. And that's why we need to make more sense. And Ben also mentioned that the science service is now under construction. We don't know what form it will be, but this is something that it will help by reorganizing the system in such a way that we find the gaps and we find the different overlaps and make something more kind of functional in such a way, more effective, better use for the money, better impact on biodiversity. So that was all I wanted to say. Happy to answer any questions then later. Thank you.
Very good, Eva. Early on, just before you started talking, there was or early on during your talk, a question came from Stephen Wolf about powerful lobbies that push perhaps different kind of emphasis on different knowledge and messages anyway. And that might be something for you to look at and think of, Eva, if we have time to address that more in the panel. But you actually addressed that quite well. So this was a really good introduction to what actually needs to happen in the process itself. Okay, I have one more open question to the audience. I can paste it in the chat. So this is not a poll. So anyone who has access to the chat can perhaps, no, well, it looks green, but what can you do? It's green. What more do we need to know to effectively channel knowledge to biodiversity governance and policy? And so perhaps this knowing the policy itself, knowing the governance actors, and also what Stephen says, the other knowledge channels might be a good start, but you might have more good ideas. Okay, from these really good introductions, I would like to now broaden the picture to other areas. And I would like to invite specialists from other areas where science policy really plays a very strong role. Like I started by saying that biodiversity conservation is very science-driven. There are other sectors that really use science in policy and decision-making. And with the panelists, we will talk about how to improve the effectiveness of science policy interfaces, how science policy interfaces perhaps can talk to this kind of systemic mechanisms that Eva was describing, and how science policy could then, it will be interesting to hear if the representatives of other knowledge science policy streams have any ideas for biodiversity conservation as well. But so we have excellent experts. We have Georg Winkel, who is a professor in Forest and Nature Conservation Policy Group at Wageningen University, where he only just started. Welcome, Georg. Georg was previously for several years at the European Forest Institute, which is very much a science policy interface actor in the forestry sector. And Georg has previously also analyzed science policy interfaces in many ways. So he will perhaps bring us ideas and comments from that angle. Next, we also have Babette Simon, who is Associate Professor at the Faculty of Health at the University of Paris. Welcome, Babette. And she's a member of the Expert Advisory Group on One Sustainable Health Forum. And she has extensive national and international experience and from many countries, might add, in healthcare with a focus on sustainability, innovation and value creation and healthcare. And like Georg's, her work also connects with biodiversity. So she will be able to reflect from that angle. And then we have a third panelist, Nikki Francescaki, a professor at the Department of Human Geography and Spatial Planning and a chair in Regional and Metropolitan Governance and Planning at Utrecht University. And just like Georg, she has only just started at this position, and previously she was in Australia. She has done a lot of research in the urban planning area in very and with this kind of transformative angle that Eva Furman was introducing. And she has worked in very many different geographical contexts. So welcome, Nikki. And I just have to check. There you are. You're just a bit narrow, so I have to navigate between my windows. Okay. And so I will start with Georg. And my first question is, what kind of experience do you have in the science policy, and how does science policy work in your area?
Yeah, thank you, Eva. Good afternoon to everyone, and greetings from Wageningen now. Really nice to be here. Well, my experience, I think you said it already. I have two hats on. First of all, I have been involved in several science policy interface activities, ranging from events, panels, up to reports written for policy makers, whoever then exactly they were. Also through my work at the European Forest Institute, but also before that at the University of Freiburg. That's one thing. And the second thing is that at the same time, sometimes I've also worked coming a bit from a political science, social science perspective on studying policy processes and the role of knowledge and science and discourses therein. Well, yeah, you asked me to prepare a bit on how the science policy work in my field. And I think my field is forest, sometimes or quite often connected to biodiversity, which makes a lot of sense, as I think everyone would agree on in this group. And I made 4 points to structure a bit my thinking. And the first point is that I think very much as Eva has just introduced in her presentation, there's a huge diversity of access channels and arrangements in the science policy interfaces relating to forest. Forests are in the spotlight of different policies, sectoral policies. Biodiversity is very important, but also economic policies, trade policies, energy policy, climate policy, obviously. And it all comes with different ideas of how science policy interface is organized. But there are also things like the importance of different reports, of expert council and panels, interface organizations like my previous employer, European Forest Institute, and of course, personal access and networks play a role. Second, and I think that's a bit a key point in my intro thinking, that there are competing sectoral and you can say paradigmatic science policy networks or silos on forests. And they are linked partly to the different policies. So for instance, if you come from a more bioeconomy perspective, vis-a-vis perhaps from a biodiversity perspective, and they are characterized by what I would say somehow shared worldviews or paradigms they operate within that go across policymakers and also scientists. And that keeps them working together in the networks. And I want to give a few examples. There's, if you want to, as social science, you sometimes like to categorize the world easily. There's a more wood production bioeconomy focused cluster where people work with an implicit or explicit assumption that this is very central, renewable resource biomass wood for dealing with forest. Its links to forest sciences, to economics, to silviculture. Then there is a more conservation community, where conservation biology, but also other disciplines play an important role, where the implicit main assumption is basically forests are nature, habitats are a place of biodiversity. They start from very different, sometimes implicit, sometimes explicit assumptions in their work. And important is it goes across policymaking and research. There are other communities that are not as visible in the EU debate. For instance, the social sciences, the more social community-based forestry approach, where you work a lot with local people. And then, of course, climate change is a big debate that comes a bit across these different silos. But to conclude on that, basically important observation that I would think is in that field very true are these a bit siloed science policy communities. Third point, before now several colleagues call me and say, what do you say about how forest-related sciences are organized? Of course, different organizations and scientists play quite different roles there. I was hoping on thinking that this book of Roger Pielke would have been mentioned already. It hasn't. So he describes different roles for scientists to engage in policy making. Issue advocates that really clearly advance a certain issue, for instance, bioeconomy, for instance, biodiversity, and are also honest about that. That's one way of positioning yourself. Pure scientists that try to abstain from the policy making, and sometimes their work is brought into policy making and they don't feel very comfortable with that. And then different roles in between, like science arbiters, honest brokers, people that try to work together with policymakers, for instance, and try to develop different scenarios and try to position themselves in between the silos that I have been mentioning too. So this diversity is a third important factor, and also organizations can play this diverse role. It's not only on the individual level. And the last observation I would like to share is a classical one, I guess, for people working at the science policy interface. There are all these challenges with complexity, uncertainty, and different logics of science and policy making. So when I recall sometimes talking to people about, well, I studied forestry 20 years ago, they say, well, this is rather easy. You plant a tree, you cut a tree, or you leave it, and then it becomes important for biodiversity. Well, this is not very complex. But of course, inter alia, through this scientific debate and through our ever-increasing knowledge on forest, it has become really complex. Just talk alone about biodiversity. We still don't know many things about biodiversity, for instance, in tropical forest. And then comes this uncertainty with climate change, where we started a kind of big experiment with forests that we really don't know. We have ideas and models how the forests will adapt and change. But then in the end, we are surprised by the reality of disturbances. So it has become very complex. And at the same time, the research community has to specialize. So you sort of reduce your topic. You look at very specific interrelations. But then when you enter the science policy interface, you are asked all these broad questions. And that's a huge challenge for scientists, that they have to guess on many points. And then, of course, you mix up what you have been really researching on with a general idea that you have about topics. And then there are finally issues like the different languages. Timing is always interesting to see that when scientists start working on a topic, and then even if it's policy oriented, they usually take more time than what policymakers want them to take. Well, this is as a starting observation, the 4 points, the challenges at the science policy interface, different positioning of individual researchers, the silos that go across the sciences and the policy making, and then finally the first point, all this diversity of access channels that you also have in the biodiversity field. Thank you.
Excellent, Georg, and thank you for bringing the simplicity with your examples of trees. This was because it is very comprehensive what you just shared. I wanted to still ask you one more question just before I go forward to Babette. Can you think of a moment where you have had like a science policy success moment in your career?
Yeah, I guess many of you have heard about the Białowieża forest in eastern Poland. Some years ago, back at IFI with colleagues, we tried to organize an initiative. Well, it is a very controversial policy debate about that forest, what to do with it and how it is managed, if it's what's happening there. And it's also controversial within the sciences, so different scientists have different viewpoints. Some years ago, we organized a meeting of the scientists that have different worldviews. We put them in a cabin in the forest. We would go out in the forest and explore the forest with them. And then we basically tried to establish some rules of a kind of academic discussion on what do we really know about the forest and what do we not know and where is our knowledge contested. And that was a very, it was a great process because it was possible to have an academic debate with people that usually don't publish together, that usually don't speak with each other even. However, the science policy element of it, that was a bit more challenging. I recall when we presented that in Brussels, the outcomes, and in Warsaw, we also got comments from the, hey, this is really nice, hello, from the policy makers. Well, you scientists, you have been working now for more than a year on that, and in the end, you find out that there's a lot of contested knowledge and uncertainty. We would like you to come up with more clear messages. I recall someone from DG Environment saying, still, I think it was a success, the way how it's organized, and also it led to a real academic debate on issues with people that usually try to avoid each other. So perhaps it was more a science success than a science policy success in the end.
Thanks for sharing. I have actually heard this same story from a conservationist before, so kind of like a different, different type of actor than you. So that's really nice that it has made an impression on both sides. Very good. Okay, next I would like Babette to share from the more health aspect. We all know during the pandemic that science feeds to policy very strongly, but you might want to share and also connect with biodiversity conservation with your opening. Please welcome Babette. You are still
Good afternoon.
Yeah.
Very warm welcome to also from my side, and thank you very much for the invitation. I think I don't have my focus on biodiversity, so I'm the external person here. I have my focus on health. However, the increasing degradation we just heard of, and destruction of the ecosystems of our environment by our human space-consuming way, way of life, I will say, has so many effects on health. And I'm a clinician, and I'm also a researcher, and went later in administration. So, what I realized is that is becoming the biggest threat to health in this century. So, and that was a way getting also more interested in biodiversity, just to understand what I'm doing here. And just a number worldwide, 1/4 of all death and illness is caused by environmental pollution and degradation. And this is a shame. So we are talking, and people are dying. And so when I heard one presentation, I thought, do we have so much time anymore to talk? And 2/3, I just last number, 2/3 of all death, and that is going to be the major threat, is due to so-called non-communicable diseases. And that is spreading all over the world. So that's why I'm interested in loss of biodiversity, not only, but that's the way how I came into. So you ask whether what kind of experience I have in science policy. I think when I did listen to all the speakers, there is not so much difference in the health system. I think it has to be science driven, I think, in your area too. And I have at 3 level actually experience. I used to be a president of a state university, so I had to deal with the state policy. For example, we did set up a marine and coastal biodiversity hub. And it is very similar to what you described, and an European medical school at that university. So to coming back to health, but as president, you look over all faculties, and that is very rich. And what is important is a common vision from your side and the politician side. So it's an iterative process, and one has to think that in partnership. So, and you have to have a common interest. So you have to make complexity simple to be successful. So it's the same thing. The second level I have experience with policy is I used to be a member of the German Science Council. And there is a scientific commission, and there is an administrative commission, and these are the state secretaries or ministers of the states in Germany, and the federal government is present too. And I think this is the highest ranking science advisory board of the German government, and contributes to a sustainable further development of the German science system to make it also internationally competitive. So it's important also if you look at EU or globally. And it's not specific to health. But this is also something where you communicate, you speak up, and you find a solution in partnership, and you have to learn it. So you learn a lot, and I think both sides, and it is always cross-cutting disciplines. You know, this is also and one finds solutions step by step. And the next level I'm now getting experience is the EU level. We address next week. You know that France has it's under the French presidency of EU that we present on the occasion of the meeting of the EU Ministers of Health and Foreign Affairs in Lyon next week. We present a declaration for a European Health Union. And maybe just a sentence, I think we have to come from Green Deal to a European Health Union. And that includes also biodiversity. We have to speak with one voice, make it simple to get our points through. And as you said, Georg, there's a lot of competition, you know, and if we compete each other away, I think, you know, my ambition is to have a healthy population and well-being. I think that is in the center of, for me, of everything. And there we have to reduce complexity, and we have to reduce competition, because I think we are so close together. And, you know, all these drivers of loss of biodiversity, climate change, all these disasters and crises, they have interlinked common drivers. And I think we all share that we want to tackle that, and we want to find solutions. And I feel sometimes, I'm a positive person, but I feel we are talking too much, talking papers, what I'm reading papers here, but I miss the action. There are recommendations, beautiful papers, but nothing done. So, and that's why I'm so interested also, and I was so happy then to understand what you are heading for. So I have this experience as at these three levels, and I have also to say that alone, I was never alone. There was also I had always many partners, scientists, practitioners, excellent people, where we reflected how could we bring this on the political table. I think one person alone can't achieve that and doesn't find the point. So I was always very happy to create that knowledge in co-production. And it's also, by the way, much more fun. What else would I like to say? Yeah, it's always an iterative process. And the last thing I would like to emphasize is it needs also a trusted relationship, I learned. So you have to be reliable what you are presenting and saying. And so the next time you are entering the room, you are a trusted person. And I think this is also something very important. And you have to find out how you make the thing you want to push forward, how to make out of this a common goal. So
Very good.
So that's maybe the principles which I found at these three levels.
Very good. Thank you, Babette. I think that this is very, very important that it comes time and again during now all the contributions to this webinar that we need to speak with one voice, and at the same time we need to enter a dialogue and we need to be humble to hear the other voices, and this is going to be the challenge, and I think that it's good that we have got to the roots of it. Babette, can you think of a moment where things would have gone beyond talking? When you say that we're just talking and we're not getting that it's superficial, but can you think of a success moment in your career where messages have really broken through?
Oh, well, it was never only my success. It was always a group process, because I learned together one is much better than alone. And everybody had his part. Yes, we got the first European medical school financed. We got the coastal marine biodiversity set up, which is now very, very successful. Hamel Center. So that was the idea, but there were so excellent researchers supporting that. But I think you have to have a vision, and then you have to go for it. And if there is something difficult, you just go a step back, meet again, and then you go in two steps further. So I think that's very important.
That's good, and that's also nice for us when we have gathered here as a collective of science policy interface enthusiasts. So we get power from each other as well.
Never lose that. No, never ever.
Very good. Okay, now I would like to move to Nikki, who is experienced in more in urban settings and transformative processes in urban settings where people are always engaged, and somehow this is, I expect that you have something to share, but would you want to share from your experience how the science policy interface has worked?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the panel, and very insightful, the previous two speakers. So I just want to add, coming from a more urban perspective. And first is about understanding, okay, so what is different when we talk about cities and science policy interface? They're like, you might, in a very simplistic way, you might say they're like two paramount differences. The first is in urban settings, in urban spaces, are the crossroads of multiple of these policies. So when you see, for example, an urban regeneration project or an urban development new area, this needs to meet and to come across multiple policies, multiple communities and stakeholders, financial interests, nature interests, as well as current and future generation interests. So this is like the first thing is about the institutional proximity, the multiple policies at interest and sometimes in conflict when we look on an urban space. The second aspect is that there are a lot of politics in space. So there are like many politicians, local level politicians from council representatives all the way to the urban planners and special planners, community organizations, neighborhood groups, citizens, industry, that they have always interests in the spaces that we live. Not only because massive investments in infrastructure are in cities and focusing on cities, but also are coming in the future. This is a context in which you need to have, in my view, policy science dialogue is very important. Not only because we need the evidence, the legitimacy, but also the speaking truth to power in terms of the urgency of taking into account climate change, social challenges like social cohesion, like urban poverty, marginalization, but also the intersection of those, like the health inequalities that the COVID pandemic revealed. We might see them now from the pandemic perspective, but that's just an amplifier of all these injustices that they are systemic, and they require a more transformative approach so as to lift these barriers and go beyond just band-aid measures. So these policy science interfaces for being productive, and they're extremely important in cities. how and what are experiences on that? What can make them also be towards action? I put the finger first to the scientists. So I think that we need as scientists to really make the extra effort into translating what our science is about for social and policy action. Is not only to put the finger back to the policymakers and say what policy has to do given the scientific evidence, but is also what society and social actors need to take into consideration. So we need to come closer, create new type of literacies in our academia, in order to make the science actionable. A lot of scientists, they are still afraid that they have to somehow hold accountable for the recommendations they give. I think this is a fear that we need to just, grow away from. Making your research actionable, provide recommendations and implications. I think it is closing the loop of fulfilling what science is about. The second aspect is about, and from my experience, what works well is the interdisciplinarity, also as a foundation. Working across different disciplines as scientists so as to produce recommendations for policy, for society, even for back to our academic environment, that they are not monofocus. They're not about only one perspective and then you create a conflict or a blind spot with other perspectives. So I think the interdisciplinary background is also a second good practice and something that will strengthen the message. The third aspect comes very close to what Babette also pointed, the aspect of a dialogue and a co-production. So we know that science is not just about the discovery, but one fundamental step is about asking the right question. If this question is being co-constructed, debated with policy actors and social actors, that will be the foundation of making science immediately policy relevant. Of course, I understand that that sounds very ideological. It's never perfect. It has a lot of criticism and received a lot of criticism of performativity of science, of corporatization of the scientific inquiry. And these are risks and implications we need to take into consideration. But we do have a lot of experience and good practices to draw from interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary research across many disciplines, ecology, urban ecology, from sustainability science, it's a big field, we don't need to defend it anymore, from environmental science and governance literatures, forestry, and on, that can really highlight the way we need to move forward. So for me, this would be my three summarizing perspectives, also to complement what has been already said.
Very good, and I think very important and nicely complementing as well. Nikki, do you want to share an experience where things have clicked in and the questions have been found and the process has gone ideally?
Well, I can highlight an experience back in 2016 with the European and Brazilian dialogues on nature-based solutions. That is an ongoing endeavor of the European Union, but it opened up this dialogue. I was the expert from the side of the Commission in order to present and bridge the knowledge of the European community as much as possible with the Ministry of Research and Innovation in Brazil. Having these dialogues, discussing with different research professionals within the ministry, that created a different narrative and a different strategy, not only for the collaboration, but also for a very important positioning document that the Ministry of Brazil created as a result of this dialogue, and created research funding for more urban experiments to take up the approach of nature-based solutions about sustainable cities and help them to move beyond and how to use a platform with a lot of evidence they had already collected. So for me, I found that this dialogue that we had explicating how the biggest research ecosystem of European Union creates evidence, but also consumes in a way the evidence of this very productive and active and very diverse policy science interface actually informs better policy. So for them, it made a click how to see the whole evidence collecting activities and mappings that they were doing, how to read them, you know, as a starting of a very useful for policy science environment. And I think this is also how of course I see it, all these different forums, interfaces, specialist groups, interest groups, e-platforms, they belong to an ecosystem of the policy science interface. It's not just one policy science interface that goes straight ahead. They're like all these different narrative development, evidence, checking, verifying, triangulating that is happening. And they're a big scientific community also for biodiversity. I work on nature-based solutions, urban ecosystem services and biodiversity for over now 10 years more. And I have seen how important it is to bring this dialogue and continue it. It's not that, oh, we know everything about it.
Super good. I think that there are many science policy interfaces like the IPCC or the IPBES that are the global panels and that do very important work. But the distance between the kind of mandate that has been given to these processes and then the use of that knowledge is it's like a huge distance compared to the process that you describe, and maybe this distance should be cut shorter. Okay, now I would it would also be interesting if you want to add something, some comment on what you heard in the presentations, although you commented on them nicely, but I would invite also Ben and Marie and Eva to put their cameras on, just so that you are in the same room with us, if people have questions for you as well. And we can take a question from the audience, and I will actually now, I think I will pick the question because I saw a really nice practical question. Some of the questions are really big. We need to digest them for a while, but there is a practical question. Have you got experience from a very local setting rather than the EU level or EU Brazil for that matter, where things would have clicked in? Maybe Georg's experience in Biolovesia is a little bit like that, but if you wanted to share on a local setting some experience that you have, and whether that's different from this kind of higher level.
I would say it's very different, and perhaps what I call you now Nikki, before I do it wrong, I guess things that you have been working on probably in cities. First of all, it's interesting that you started for cities similar as forests, that there are these cross policy issues, and I wonder if this is not true for many fields we're dealing with, that they're all interconnected with policies. Well, but I wanted to say one of the things when I started working at the European Forest Institute in my previous employment is that there is a strong science practice interface that also works a lot with, let's say, very local, concrete forest managers and how they interact with local administrations. And the experience there is just that the jargon alone is so different that within the, let's say, within the policy administrative system. So I recall that I was then giving there a speech to that community with very practical questions. And I had this feeling after half of the speech, well, I'm talking here in my own science and also EU-oriented language bubble, and I need to think about that. And I was really trying to start a dialogue, and that was then really interesting and super helpful. But what I want to really say, what I now found really interesting in our discussion is that we have a bit different poles of the debate. We had this one voice versus many voices thing. I think we had also this different roles that some of the panelists is implicitly taken up. I think Babette, with all your experience, this is super interesting that you said, but also in the chat, this a bit like having a clear idea, vision where you want to work towards. That is one interesting pool vis-a-vis this more debate, academic debate, free, well, let's say a bit open in terms of results. And then I like this idea of the ecosystem. I think it was Nikki saying that, and then Eva commenting on that as well. And perhaps it needs these different niches. I'm not an ecology researcher, as many here of the participants are, but perhaps there are these different roles, and perhaps we should enjoy this plurality of formats. But what is then really important, I think that is what Babette said, is that we are clear about the role we play. Are we advocating for an issue? And it can be very justified. There was a comment in the chat about climate science. If you really see this is going totally in the totally wrong direction, then I think it's very justified to be a clear advocate. But I think what is important that as a scientist, when you choose your role and your niche, that you are transparent about that. And then it results also in the trust that I understood, Babette, you have been highlighting. So perhaps this is one solution to this dilemma, but then we probably end up with the same map of institutions that we already have. So and that's a bit the question, if you like that.
Very good, thanks, Georg. I think that we both Babette and Nikki said a bit this, that the interdisciplinarity is kind of one step in this direction, that then we are talking across different systems anyway, even if it is not to the policy or practice, but it's talking more general language, perhaps, just like you are saying. Would Eva or Ben or Mari want to comment on these? Do you have, you can, Eva, just if you don't want, you can, yeah.
Yeah,
can
well, I guess. Do you mean the talks as such or the last discussion?
Either.
The different. Yeah, okay, so maybe I could just say a few words about this, whether we go with one voice or have multiple voices. I would say that we need both there as well. I mean, science policy and science policy society is taking place on many different levels and in different processes. But then when I'm thinking about it from the policy maker's perspective, especially now I'm thinking about actually on national level. And when you come with these reports that have quite different angle to same thing, it is quite difficult for the policymaker to use that one and actually also advocate it in the publicity. And because I'm thinking that the science policy society interface is in a way helping the decision makers, but it's also changing the norms in the society. And if we are always coming and bringing a new element that it's for biodiversity, it's health, it's actually the food, or it's actually something else. And this is the most important, and it's not that other. So it makes it very complicated to, in a way, to give a sort of bigger picture. And that's why I have personally, even though I'm a marine biologist, I very much take the sustainability approach where you have more like a holistic sustainability approach. And that's the way how you can tackle, for example, biodiversity.
Very good. Apologies for my dog. It's seeing another dog outside the window. Babette, please. You are
I wanted to reply to Georg. I think, of course, blue sky research, I mean, there are so many voices and they have to be there. Research-driven, this process of research-driven solution has many hats. There is not one voice, of course. That is, however, if we want politicians act against climate change, I mean, we have so much knowledge. I saw it also in the chat. I can only enforce that. There is a lot of knowledge. We do have a lot of knowledge about climate change. We do have a lot of knowledge about biodiversity. This didn't come overnight, and we are missing action. So, and then we have to ask the question, why? And maybe we have a problem with communication, and I think also yeah, now this initiative here tries to compensate that. I mean, you are also very research driven and think about, so how could we bring our research driven knowledge to action, right? And I still think if we have really something very important, we have to speak then simple and in one voice. That does not mean that one person is running to the politician, no, but that we talk to each other. I think everybody can bring in a part, a very important argument. And then we settle and speak with one voice. And one thing which I experience is very, very important. We have to include also society. We have to include not only researchers and not only practitioners, but also people from society, civil people. For example, in the Research Council German, there are always people from society in there. It's not only researchers and politicians. And this is very valuable. And the question is why, I realize in medicine, we have one huge potential, potential unused, and that's also why I started our book Planetary Health, and invited, or together with 3 other editors, and we invited authors from the clinical subdisciplines. They were far away, some of them, some were very close, some were not that close, and because they see every day so many citizens, everybody had in his life a visit with a doctor or not. Yeah. So, and this is a huge potential to transport that issue into society. I think this is so important. That's why I am here also today. And I think we have to do there more. However, I still think we have to put health at the core of the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals in order to get the society engaged, and in order to make understandable that there is no time for action. I think you are all brilliant researchers. So, I mean, we know so much. No action, not enough, not enough. Lots of papers here. And I think it's time to act.
Thank you, Babette. We go forward a bit, and Mari has her hand up, but like now I would ask Mari to type your issue in the chat if you can, because we have a lot of questions in the chat. And I thought that it would be nice to take one question still before we move forward from the chat. And Riikka Paloniemi, a senior researcher, our colleague from SYKE in the Alternet Management Board, has promised to read one of the questions in the chat. So Riikka, what would be a good question that you have picked? There's many.
There are many interesting questions. Thank you all for asking and writing them down. We have been discussing with the team here that this Niklas question about your experiences about what are the criteria of science policy interface effectiveness, and do you see that should we be able to improve the effectiveness science policy interfaces somehow? Or what do you think about criteria that are listed in the literature: applicability, comprehensiveness, timing, and accessibility? Does they work? Or do you have any comments about this criteria? What is the successful science policy interface?
How do you judge that the science policy interface is successful? Because today we have heard that it is if the message is clear, if the society needs the answer. But would you, which is the most important criterion? Georgia, please.
Well, for me, it would be that policymakers are informed about everything, or not everything, that is needed to make their decisions that is happening in the research community from different disciplines.
Mm.
And
So
this might be a bit naive if you look at the reality of policymaking, but that they are aware of all relevant consequences. That is very difficult to measure, I believe.
Yeah. That was one of the criteria listed in this Niklas's question. I think that the relevance is very important. Perhaps there is this risk that was you, Georg, who said that we might become puppets who are running around answering all those questions, or maybe Nikki said that early. Anyone else want to comment on that? Yeah, Nikki,
I put on this. I think it's also about evidence of shifts in narratives, shifts in policy directions because of the policy science interface. So I don't want that participants leaving the webinar thinking about, okay, so if it's always, you know, like complementing or adding to a direction, then it's a successful or an effective policy science interface. It's often also the case that you bring a diversion or a change of perspective exactly because of this dialogue, a change of the focus. So I would also say that observing shifts in terms of narrative, of policy objectives, of policy directions, it's very important. And you have seen that especially, it's not in biodiversity, but more in the energy sector with the climate change policy of the divestment movement and the divestment policies, that some things become not anymore eligible for funding or even research support. This is a big shift. And we have seen this also in forestry and biodiversity. The new EU forestry has some of these indications as well. So that's also for me an effective one.
Very good. That was good to be somehow adaptive in the societal emphasis. What about if we need to bring up a new angle, then that it is actually for the scientists to bring up the new angle? Or there was a really challenging question earlier, if climate policy seems that it's not sufficient. Some author says that scientists should stop supporting climate policy altogether because it's not meeting the targets, and how you would react to that. But now I will take you want to comment, so please, Babette. And if you can be brief, Babette, we still have one more question that we try to deal with before we wrap up.
May I just say I was very impressed. I mean, I was not so close to Alter, but what I really appreciated how much emphasis you put on the young researchers to get them trained to learn how to communicate into policy. I just wanted to say that was important for me, because I think when I was young, we didn't talk to politicians, right? And this is a great program. I just wanted to say that was important for me.
That's very good, and maybe that is a channel to teach all this, like this navigating the different levels of simplicity and complexity, and having a clear message, but yet listening to what policymakers really need. Eva, you had a point. Did you want to add?
Actually, Nikki said quite what I was going to say. If you want, are we still having at the end a moment if I reply to Stephen's question, or should we take it now?
I think we can take that now, because I think that it connects to this. So Stephen's question was that if there are lobbies or lobbyists who are conveying a strong message that goes against with what your scientific community is saying, how do you address those voices?
So I would firstly like to say, well, Stephen especially pointed out to businesses and his investors and so forth. I would like to say that different actors, whether they are from business or from civil society, they have always different stakes. So at the same time, there are several businesses who are really wanting to collaborate and finding the criteria how they can support this transformation. And so they are quite good also gateholders for the rest and changing kind of the whole business sector in a way, building these roadmaps jointly. But then on the other hand, we have also like nature conservation actors who might actually suggest and lobby really strongly something that is not really supported by the evidence from scientists, in the sense what's the effective way of actually advocating and having governance. So it's not so simple at all. And that's why I'm still saying that it's very, very important to identify those with power, bring them to the table, discuss, but also doing some action where you, in a way, develop some transition in some transition arenas, ways how to move forward. And it's of course the policymakers also to be able to do this kind of learning to read different actors. And that's really the job from social scientists, to make these analyses and bring up these underlying issues, so that policymakers can be more strong and can then actually base their facts that there are some fundamental issues in ecology that we have to strictly keep on, and this is the space where you are able in a way to take your act with your lobby. So I don't know if that helped at all.
Yeah. No, that's very good. We actually have one more question that we would like to ask, and Riikka will ask it. That is a bit related to this, that we have this, I mean, I think that Stephen was referring to quite systematic knowledge lobbying, where the businesses and finance might not actually be so collaborative with biodiversity conservation. But Riikka could ask the question about other kind of phenomena that we deal with in the society.
Yeah, thank you. The challenges that we are discussing today, biodiversity loss and its linkages to all possible social sectors and actors, including these lobbying actors or commercial actors, these things are huge. And thus we would like to ask you a question that has not been previously so much asked in the context of science policy interfaces, and it's linked to emotions. How do you think that we address or deal with emotions and environmental worries and possible even angst among stakeholders and us researchers as a part of the science policy interfaces?
Very good. Thank you, Riikka. This is such an interesting question, because we encounter angst among our colleagues and our stakeholders and see it in the media, and we might feel that ourselves. I would really like everyone to be able to say how you, really briefly, how you deal with environmental emotions. And maybe Babette, you can go first. Your hand is up, but you can try to be brief so we have time to ask others.
I'm sorry, I wanted to say something to the systematic lobbying, not to this. That was still my hand up, but we changed the topic.
Maybe you can type that in the chat if you have time.
Okay.
If someone else wants to comment on the emotions, have you encountered emotions at your work that would interfere with the science policy interface? Or is this an out of the blue question? Yes, Georg, please.
Well, just to give us a start, I think emotions are super important. I mean, many of us that deal with different issues we are super interested in. At least in my case, I can say it was an emotional relationship with nature that I started becoming interested in these issues and finally studied it. And I guess it might be the same for several of us. I think emotions always come up, especially also in polarized debates at the science policy interface. And I would think this is just fine, and we should be transparent about it. And I think this is something really important, that we just, if emotions play a role, that we are transparent about them being here. And then, of course, there is a bit a challenge that then you are seen as not being rational, scientific. And I guess then it helps to be transparent about that, but also reflexive. And perhaps, was it Babette saying that working in teams is also very helpful, that you can also reflect on this emotional aspect with your peers and also with colleagues coming from quite other backgrounds and disciplines. And then I think this is a productive way also to be transparent about it, to let not, how to say, to be in the end a lot, or well, it's connecting back to the strong lobbies, a lot of the power that science has, and I think science has a power in the policy making process, is related to things that we are transparent, that we are self-reflexive, and that we are also critical. And I think this is something where then also being aware or trying to be aware about the role of emotions can help us a lot. And that's also where I'm a bit skeptical about the one voice, because I think this might go then in a direction that we lose this strong power of science, which is that we allow for many voices.
Might add to the polarization.
So now
Okay,
I try
if
to
we
put
can
everything in one thing. Okay.
Very good. If Mari wants to comment quickly, then Ben, then Nikki, and then unfortunately I need to cut because Julie will still say some final words. Sorry, Juliet, and Juliet Young is the science policy host in the Alternet, so she will still continue. But Mari, you can go next.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to be quick then. I agree with Georg. I think emotions are extremely important in a way. In my work, I think those emotions, even bad emotion like frustration, are actually positive because it gets people engaged in science policy interface. We see it through our numerous experts applying to be part of our expert working group. Number one motivation is their frustration. Their frustration of having too much knowledge and too little action. So I think, yeah.
And we have heard that today as well. So that's a good message. And Ben?
Yeah, just adding a little flavor to that same frustration example, which I also put in the chat. Frustration is not only with the messenger, with scientists or researcher or the boundary organizations bringing the message, but my experience is also with policymakers at local or even European level, that you may have a listening ear within the environment policy making sector, and they are very much following and building their decisions on research or data or knowledge, but they are equally frustrated in not getting across their silo to other ministries or departments or sectors. So that's also something that, yeah, even more difficult to influence, apart from the lobbying from commercial or other interests.
Very good. And then I invite Nikki to still say quickly, and then I invite Juliet Young, senior scientist from INRAE, to turn your camera on so that you can close after that. But Nikki, you go.
Okay, so a very quick intro to this. I find that is very important working the policy science interface. In a European city, I was running a workshop with citizen organizations, scientists, and policymakers of the city. And it was so loaded with so many emotions. And at some point, I was risking the fact that, okay, politicians were like replying back, but in a very defensive way to what the citizens were saying. So it was becoming literally like a battle. So my intervention to this was to actually stop everybody and say, okay, wait a second, what you're saying is very important. Can you just explain where this frustration and this like mistrust comes from? Can you give us a little bit more of the story? And I had to really say to the policymakers in the break, like, okay, don't respond, listen. I understand that you feel frustrated, that you think that you did everything you could, and that's not appreciated, not recognized, a lot of emotions here. Just make me this favor that we listen to the story. And we reply after, you know, but like for now, let me handle it. Just don't reply, like stay there, debrief, and let's listen. Why is this emotion? So it's more about the literacy to unpack the message. And
very
that
good.
But it took us, of course, much more time to go through that. It was almost like a workshop. It worked very productively after that because the citizens felt that, okay, you are listening to us. You're not just respond back to shut us up. It was very hurtful for the local policymakers. I can tell you this. They felt like we have been doing so much. They don't understand how complex it is, how much effort it takes. I'm like, yes, you're all valid, everything you say. Listen first. Let's see what we can do, you know. So that worked well, very productive, but you need someone to stay calm.
Very good. Now, this was excellent. Maybe this is a good message for us as well, that we should listen more. But so thank you on my part now, and I hand over to Juliet, and Juliet has a final poll for us and tells us how we can meet up again.
Thank you very much, Eva. So as Eva said, together with my colleagues, Marie van der Wel and Alan Watt, we are very lucky to be leading on the sort of SPI activities front of Alternet. And this webinar, of course, was very much part of these science policy interface activities. And I was very much looking forward to the webinar, and I'm absolutely delighted with how it's gone. And my only frustration, if we're talking about emotions, is that actually it was way too short, and I want to go into lots of these discussions a lot more, but unfortunately we've all got very busy lives and things like that. So I just want to, before I go into the next steps, I do want to just thank profusely the SYKE team for all their brilliant organization and support, especially Eva, actually both Evas, Suvi, Rika, etc. And you've been really fantastic in leading this this webinar. I also want to thank Alternet, and specifically Maurice, for encouraging SPI activities and bringing us all together. All the speakers, thank you to Ben and Marie and Eva for your brilliant talks, and also the panelists. Thank you very much to Georg, Babette and Nikki for your insights. That was really fantastic. And also a huge thanks to the participants, because I think at one stage I actually noted that there are 110 people on, which is really fantastic. And what was most fantastic was all your interaction on the chat. It was really, really great. And there's lots in there that we're going to digest now. So in terms of the next steps, what we're going to be doing is that within the next few days, we're going to be posting a short summary of this webinar on the Alternet website. And included in that summary, I think, will be a lot of the thoughts that have come in through the chat, because they're really absolutely thought-provoking and really exciting aspects that have come out there. And we will also post the recording of the webinar, and there'll be the resources from the UFZ seminar that we'd already done in 2019 as well. So everything will hopefully be in one place so that all the resources are accessible to all. We are also, very excitingly, planning another webinar on SPIs as part of the Alternet series in June, maybe hosted by ESSRG, who showed an interest in it this morning, so that will be really excellent. But obviously we'll be starting discussions on that very rapidly. And so obviously in time that'll be advertised, and we'll get in touch with you so that we can all get together again for another exciting webinar. And so I think now I would like to ask Suvi maybe to put up the poll for the next webinar. And the questions here are: what would you want the next Alternet Science Policy webinar to address? Would it be sort of knowledge needs in policy, role division in science policy, the functionality of different science policy platforms, or other? And in the other, I would really encourage you to write loads of different suggestions, because even if we don't use the topics exactly for the next webinar, it gives us really, really good information on what the possible topics for the next ones will be, because of course the idea with these webinars is that it's a long series, and we're just going to be carrying on over the months and years with webinars every few months hosted by Alternet institutions. So please put your responses in the chat, and otherwise you can always contact me directly and send some ideas of what you would like the future webinars to cover. And so for the moment, it looks like we've got quite a bit on role in science policy interfaces, also on knowledge needs, that's still quite high, and also on functionality. And we've got a few, nice suggestions, including one from Georg there on ways of science policy dialogues across siloed sectors. I know, yes. And priority setting, which came up in the chat as well. Yeah. Wonderful. Okay. Well, anyway, carry on putting those in, and we'll keep all of those and use them in our summary and our next webinars. So thank you very much, and I'd like to pass over maybe now to Eva again.
Thank you. On my part, thank you to the panelists. Thank you to the excellent questions to the audience. Thank you to the speakers who drove us into this really good discussion. Thank you, everyone, and see you next time. Did Maurice want to say thanks once more, and then we can stop recording?
Well, indeed. Thanks more. Well, great, and great to have people in the panel who are not immediately involved in biodiversity. That's really of great added value. And I wish you all a good digest, as Juliette suggested, just not for the people of the council meeting who meet again at 16:15 for continuation of a very boring but a very important council meeting end. Thank you very much all, and see you in June on the next webinar, in June on the next conference, or any of the younger participants in the summer school by the end of September. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Maurice. And now we can stop recording and we can turn off our cameras.